Dr. Richard Turner, a 55-year-old highly respected surgeon at a prominent Chicago hospital, had spent his life meticulously building his career. For over 30 years, his reputation as a skilled and compassionate doctor had earned him the admiration of colleagues and patients alike. He was the epitome of success, calm, calculated, and in control of every operation, every diagnosis. But beneath his professional persona, there was a different reality, one that was far from perfect. At home, things were different. Dr. Turner's marriage to Karen, a 55-year-old homemaker, was falling apart slowly, imperceptibly. The once deep connection between them had been replaced with distance. Karen, who had once been the heart of their family, now spent her days alone in their large, quiet house. She often found herself lost in thought, staring out the window, waiting for Dr. Turner to come home after another long, exhausting day at the hospital. Their conversations had become mundane, and the spark that once existed between them seemed to have faded with the passing years. Karen loved her husband, but she had begun to feel invisible. He was always busy, always engrossed in his work. She understood the demands of his career, but as the years went by, the emotional neglect grew harder to ignore. The nights grew lonelier. The warmth of their love had dissipated, leaving a cold void. And though she longed to be held, to feel loved again, Karen didn't know where to turn. She didn't know how to voice her pain without sounding needy. So she kept her feelings to herself. The change in her began subtly. She started going out more often, spending evenings at a local bar with friends, seeking the comfort of familiar faces. She hadn't planned on meeting anyone, but it was in the dim light of a quiet evening at the bar that she first met Jason Hart. He was a 32-year-old bartender with a warm smile and an easy charm. They started talking casually at first, a joke here, a compliment there. Karen found herself drawn to him, not just because he was handsome, but because he saw her. He noticed her, listened to her, and for the first time in a long while, Karen felt alive again. At first, it was harmless. They shared a few conversations, exchanged smiles, and laughed. Jason's attention was flattering, and Karen, starved for affection, began looking forward to their interactions. It wasn't love, not yet at least, but it was something she hadn't felt in years, connection. Dr. Turner, on the other hand, had no idea of the change taking place in his wife. He was consumed by his work. The hospital needed him, and that was where he spent most of his energy. He was proud of his success, proud of the life he had built. But as his career soared, his personal life began to unravel. Dr. Turner didn't see the signs of Karen's growing loneliness. He was so wrapped up in his own world that he failed to notice the emptiness in hers. He thought everything was fine, that Karen was just adjusting to the quiet after their children had grown and left. He never imagined that his absence was creating a chasm between them. Karen had never meant for things to escalate with Jason. But when she began seeing him more frequently, the excitement of their secret meetings began to overpower the guilt. She justified it to herself. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She just wanted to feel important again, to feel desired. But every stolen moment with Jason made her feel more conflicted. She knew what she was doing was wrong, yet the warmth and attention she received from him were something she hadn't felt in years. Dr. Turner had no idea what was unfolding behind closed doors. His life, so meticulously planned and controlled, was about to be shattered by something he couldn't see coming. Karen's affair was just beginning to take root, and soon everything would change. Dr. Richard Turner's life was becoming a monotonous blur of surgeries, consultations, and long hours at the hospital. His dedication to his work, though admirable, was beginning to consume him. With each passing day, the hours he spent at the hospital piled up, while the time he spent at home with Karen, his wife of 30 years, grew smaller and smaller. His pride in his professional accomplishments only seemed to magnify the invisible distance between them. It wasn't that Dr. Turner didn't care about Karen. He did. But the passion that once existed in their marriage was now buried beneath years of routine. The small things he used to do to show her affection, like writing her little notes or bringing home flowers, had become forgotten, overshadowed by his endless work. Karen, once the loving and attentive wife, now seemed like a shadow in their home, He had convinced himself that she was adjusting to the empty nest, content in her role as a homemaker. But something was changing in Karen, something he couldn't quite place. The first sign that something wasn't right came on a Tuesday evening. Dr. Turner had just returned from a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital, his body aching and his mind exhausted. He expected to find Karen in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she always did. But instead, the house was eerily quiet. He wandered through the rooms, calling her name, but received no answer. His thoughts shifted to their usual pattern. She must have been out with friends, he thought. It wasn't uncommon for her to take a walk in the neighborhood or visit one of the nearby shops. Yet, as the evening wore on, he found himself waiting for her return. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m., Dr. Turner began to grow uneasy. He checked his phone, no missed calls or messages from Karen. He hadn't been expecting any, but the silence felt wrong. This wasn't like her. It wasn't long before the sound of the front door creaked open. Karen stepped inside, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes avoiding his. "Where were you?" Dr. Turner asked, his voice edged with concern. He tried to keep it casual, but the unease was growing within him. "I was just out for a bit," Karen replied, her tone distant, almost guarded. She moved past him without making eye contact, heading toward the kitchen as if nothing was amiss. Dr. Turner watched her silently for a moment, the weight of the question hanging in the air. He wanted to press her, to ask if everything was okay, but he didn't. He was too tired to argue, and besides, he didn't want to seem paranoid. But the feeling lingered, the sense that something was off. The next few days passed with the same routine. Karen continued to be distant, though not outwardly hostile. Her smiles were smaller, her conversations shorter. Dr. Turner tried to shake off the growing feeling that something was wrong, telling himself it was just the stress of their busy lives getting to both of them. But it wasn't just the silence that troubled him. There was an air of secrecy about Karen, a subtle change in her behavior that he couldn't quite identify. Then came the evening when Dr. Turner caught a glimpse of the truth. He had just returned home after a long shift and decided to stop by the local coffee shop to pick up some dessert for the two of them. He needed something to take his mind off the endless surgeries. But as he walked through the door, his heart stopped. Karen was sitting at a corner table laughing. The man sitting across from her was not someone Dr. Turner recognized. The way they spoke to each other, the easy camaraderie between them was more than just friendly. Karen's hand lingered on the man's arm in a way that felt intimate. Dr. Turner stood frozen in the doorway, his pulse quickening as the realization began to settle in. His mind raced. Who was this man? What was going on? Was it possible? Was Karen really having an affair? He turned and walked out without a word. His mind was spinning, his emotions a blur of confusion, hurt, and anger. He couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. He needed time to process this, to figure out what was really happening. That night, Karen returned home late. She acted as though nothing had happened, but Dr. Turner couldn't shake the image of her laughing with that man. The smile on her face was one he hadn't seen in a long time, and it was no longer directed at him. As Karen slipped into bed beside him that night, Dr. Turner lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His heart felt heavy, and his mind raced with questions. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation for what he'd seen. But deep down, he knew. Something had changed, and it wasn't just Karen. Dr. Richard Turner couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Karen laughing with Jason Hart at that bar flashed in his mind. The smile she had worn was one he hadn't seen in years, a smile that wasn't meant for him. The warmth between them was palpable, and Dr. Turner could no longer pretend that everything was okay. He knew something was wrong, and now, more than ever, he needed answers. The next morning, instead of heading straight to the hospital, he sat at his desk in the study, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. His mind was elsewhere. He couldn't concentrate on anything, not when the one person he trusted most had just shattered his world. He couldn't confront Karen yet, not until he knew the full extent of what was happening. The questions gnawed at him. Was she in love with Jason? How long had this been going on? Was their marriage just a lie? The answer, he realized, lay in the details. Dr. Turner was a man of precision, and he needed evidence. He had to see it with his own eyes. His mind turned to the only option left: investigation. Dr. Turner hired a private investigator. He found someone reliable, someone who had worked with high-profile cases before and could gather the information without alerting Karen. He didn't know what he was hoping to find, but the need for certainty was overwhelming. He needed to know the truth, even if it tore him apart. The investigator, a seasoned man named Charles, wasted no time. He began to shadow Karen discreetly, tracking her every move. Over the next few days, Dr. Turner received regular updates, each one more unsettling than the last. Charles reported seeing Karen meeting Jason at various locations around the city, usually late in the evening after Dr. Turner had left for work. At first, the meetings were brief. The two would exchange a few words, a fleeting touch, and then part ways. But over time, their meetings became more frequent and longer. The final blow came when Charles reported that Karen and Jason had been seen entering a hotel late one evening. It was the moment Dr. Turner feared, the confirmation that Karen's relationship with Jason was not just a fleeting affair, but something more. Dr. Turner felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had suspected something, but seeing the cold reality of it in black and white hit him harder than he could have imagined. The man who had been everything to so many people, the one who saved lives daily, was now completely powerless in the face of his wife's betrayal. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breath. The anger was beginning to rise, hot and unrelenting, but he forced himself to stay calm. Charles's report arrived late one afternoon while Dr. Turner was sitting in his office at the hospital, preparing for another long night. The paper shook in his hands as he read through the details. Photos of Karen and Jason laughing together outside a cafe, holding hands in public, looking like any other couple. The final photograph was the most damning. Karen, in a quiet moment, resting her head on Jason's shoulder. It was all too much to bear. Dr. Turner wanted to throw the report away, to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he couldn't. He had to face it. His life, his marriage had fallen apart. But what would he do now? He couldn't just sit back and let it continue. He needed to confront Karen, not with accusations, but with the cold, hard evidence. He hadn't planned for this. He had always believed that their marriage, like his career, would endure. But now, reality had set in with a sharp sting. Karen wasn't just his wife anymore. She had become a stranger, someone who had lied to him, betrayed him, and, worse still, had moved on without him. Dr. Turner sat back in his chair, his fingers rubbing his temples as he tried to gather his thoughts. The next step was clear. He had to confront Karen. But how? What would he say to her? How could he even look her in the eye after all of this? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Charles, the private investigator, standing in the doorway with a solemn look on his face. "I've got one more piece of information for you, Dr. Turner," Charles said quietly, stepping inside and handing him another envelope. Dr. Turner's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know whether he wanted to open it or burn it, but he couldn't stop himself. As he opened the envelope, he found a small collection of photos, each one showing Karen with Jason at various locations, at a park, a museum, and most recently, entering a small apartment building. The most shocking photo, however, was the one at the bottom of the pile. It was of Jason holding Karen in his arms, not as a lover, but as a man who had claimed her. They were kissing, their bodies entwined, and it was as if nothing else in the world mattered. Dr. Turner felt his heart sink. This was the moment he knew his marriage was over. There was no turning back now. The air in the house felt heavier than it had ever been. Dr. Turner's hands were trembling as he stood by the door, staring at the pile of photographs in front of him. The images were vivid, each one a confirmation of what he had already feared: Karen's betrayal. They weren't just pictures, they were a roadmap to his personal destruction. He had waited too long for this moment, the moment of truth. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He glanced at his watch. Karen would be home soon. His heart raced, his thoughts spinning. The hospital had been draining him lately, but today was different. Today he couldn't focus on anything but the confrontation that was about to unfold. He had already prepared himself for the worst, but a part of him still hoped he was wrong. still hoped that maybe, just maybe, there was another explanation. The front door creaked open, and Karen stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning the room. She looked at him, then at the table where the photos lay. Her face immediately shifted, a mixture of fear and guilt flashing across her features. Dr. Turner didn't speak at first. He just watched her, his breath shallow. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to shout, to accuse her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. Karen took a tentative step forward. "Richard, what's going on?" Her voice was soft, laced with concern, but there was a nervous edge to it. She knew. He gestured to the table, his voice low, controlled, but full of a quiet intensity. "Sit down, Karen." She hesitated, then slowly made her way to the chair across from him. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the back of the chair. She sat, eyes avoiding his, but she couldn't hide the fear now creeping into her features. Dr. Turner exhaled sharply, then spoke again, his words measured. "I know about you and Jason." Karen's face paled, and she quickly glanced down at the photos. For a moment there was nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Dr. Turner continued, his voice growing harder with each word. "How long, Karen? How long has this been going on?" She swallowed, her gaze still fixed on the table. "Richard, I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it?" Dr. Turner's voice rose and he leaned forward, his fists clenched. "You didn't mean for it? How do you explain this, Karen?" He gestured toward the photographs, the evidence of her infidelity, of the life she had been leading behind his back. "What do you think I'm supposed to believe?" Karen's lips trembled, her eyes beginning to well up. "It wasn't like that. I never meant to hurt you." "Then what was it, Karen?" Dr. Turner's words were sharp, almost cutting. "What was it that you were doing with him, laughing, holding hands, kissing? What was it if not an affair?" His voice broke slightly at the end, the pain of betrayal seeping through despite his attempts to remain composed. Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she finally met his gaze. "I was lonely, Richard. You were always so busy, and I needed someone. Jason, he saw me, Richard. He listened to me. I felt important to him." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of her confession. Dr. Turner's chest tightened. "Is that all I was to you? A workaholic, a doctor in a white coat, too distracted to care about his own wife?" Karen's voice shook as she replied, "No, Richard, it wasn't like that. You were everything to me, at first. But things changed. I changed. And I needed more than what you could give." Dr. Turner's mind was spinning. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with everything, was now sitting across from him, telling him that she had felt invisible in their marriage. He didn't know what to feel: rage, sorrow, disbelief, all of them mixed together, leaving him breathless. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Dr. Turner wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to say anything more. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too much for him to process all at once. Karen reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on his. "Richard, I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking. I was just so lost. And Jason, he made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore." Dr. Turner recoiled, pulling his hand back sharply. "So this was about feeling seen?" His voice was cold now, each word like a dagger. "What about everything we had? What about the life we built?" Tears were streaming down Karen's face now, her body shaking with quiet sobs. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." But it was too late. Dr. Turner stood up suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I can't do this anymore. I can't look at you and pretend everything is fine." His chest heaved as he tried to steady himself. He couldn't even look at her anymore without feeling the weight of her betrayal. Karen stood as well, her hand reaching out to him. "Richard, please. I didn't want it to go this far. I love you, but I was desperate." Dr. Turner shook his head. "Love? You love me?" He paused, his voice breaking. "You don't love me, Karen. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me. Karen collapsed into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Dr. Turner walked toward the door, his back to her, his hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't stay in this house, not with the memory of what she had done now hanging in the air between them. "I'm leaving," he said quietly without looking back. "I need space. I need to think." And with that, he walked out, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Karen alone in the silence of the room. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt suffocating, the kind that only came after a storm. Dr. Turner had left hours ago, and Karen sat in their empty living room, still staring at the spot where he had stood moments before. His words echoed in her mind, each one a painful reminder of everything she had destroyed. The man she had once loved, the man who had given her everything, had walked out the door, and now she was left alone with her guilt. Karen's hands trembled as she wiped her tear-streaked face. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Her heart ached for the life she had shattered, for the love she had thrown away. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the feelings she had buried for so long. She had been alone for so long, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of Dr. Turner's absence in their marriage had been too much to carry. Jason had given her the attention she craved, the attention she had needed to feel alive again. She stood up, pacing back and forth in the room, trying to make sense of everything. She couldn't believe how far things had gone. This wasn't what she had wanted. She hadn't planned to fall in love with Jason. She hadn't meant to hurt Richard. But now, as she replayed the events in her mind, she realized that she had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Jason was standing on the other side, his face unreadable. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for Dr. Turner. "Where is he?" Jason asked, his voice sharp. Karen swallowed hard, her stomach turning at the mention of Richard's name. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason's brow furrowed. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" I confronted him," Karen said, her voice breaking. "I told him everything." Jason stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softer now, though there was an edge to his voice. He wasn't worried about Karen's well-being as much as his own position in all of this. His face was filled with frustration, as if he were disappointed in the outcome of the confrontation. Karen met his eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love him, Jason, but I love you too. I don't know what to do. I never wanted this to happen." Jason's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Karen, you can't go back to him. You know that. It's over between you two." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're mine now. You've always been mine. Don't you see that?" Karen closed her eyes, his words washing over her like cold water. Part of her wanted to agree with him. Jason had given her what Richard hadn't, a sense of being seen, of being important. But another part of her felt torn. Richard had been the man she married, the man who had shared her life for years. She couldn't just erase that, no matter how much she felt the pull toward Jason. "I don't know if I can leave him," she murmured, almost to herself. Jason's patience was wearing thin. He grabbed her by the arms, his grip firm. "You don't have a choice, Karen. He's gone. You need to choose. Choose me." The forcefulness in his voice hit her like a slap. She pulled away from him, her eyes wide with shock. "I can't just forget about him, Jason," she said, her voice shaking. "He's the father of my children. He was my partner for so long. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Jason replied, his voice cold now. "You've been with him long enough. It's time to move on, Karen. It's time to be with someone who actually wants you." Karen recoiled, the words cutting through her. Was he right? Had she been clinging to a marriage that no longer existed? Was it time to walk away from everything she had known? She didn't know. Her head was spinning, her emotions torn in every direction. The silence between them was thick. Karen wanted to scream, to cry, to throw everything away and run, but she couldn't. She was stuck in this web of lies, betrayal, and guilt, and she didn't know how to escape. Jason took a step closer to her, his expression softening. "You're not alone, Karen. I'm here for you." Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him. She knew the decision she had to make. She knew it was time to let go of Richard, to stop pretending that everything could go back to the way it was. But deep down, something inside her screamed that this wasn't right. She wasn't ready to lose everything just to escape the pain. Karen turned away from Jason, her breath ragged. "I need some time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's face darkened, his patience worn thin. "Time?" he repeated, his tone icy. "We don't have time, Karen. You're either with me or you're not." Karen's mind raced. She didn't have the answers, but she knew she couldn't make a choice in this moment. She needed clarity, something she didn't have. Jason let out a frustrated sigh and walked out, leaving Karen alone in the silence. Dr. Turner couldn't breathe. The anger simmering inside him had built to a point of no return. He had left the house hours ago, unable to stay in the same space as Karen. Every inch of their home reminded him of her betrayal, of the life they had built together, only for it to be torn apart by a man younger, more attentive, and, in his mind, undeserving. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the pressure. He needed to do something, anything, to regain control. The emotional devastation was suffocating. He had tried to be patient, to reason with Karen, but her indifference had broken something deep within him. And now there was Jason. Dr. Turner had no intention of letting the situation slide. The betrayal had poisoned him, clouding his judgment. He had to act. He was a man of action, a surgeon who made decisions with precision. The fact that Karen could do this to him, lie to his face, and then leave with another man, it was too much. He wasn't thinking clearly. The pain was overwhelming. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He looked down at the screen. It was Karen. His stomach churned, and he almost didn't pick up. But something in him, something twisted, compelled him to answer. "What do you want, Karen?" His voice was low, sharp. He tried to mask the storm raging inside him, but his words betrayed him. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. "Please, can you come home?" Dr. Turner's grip tightened on the phone. "Talk? About what? About how you've been sleeping with him behind my back? About how you've completely shattered everything we had?" There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment Dr. Turner thought she might hang up. But then she spoke again, quieter this time. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm sorry. Please, I know I've hurt you, but I can't lose you. We need to fix this." Her words, dripping with guilt, made his blood boil. He had heard enough. His mind was already made up. There was no fixing this. There was no coming back from this. "Don't bother coming home. I'll be gone by the time you get back," he said coldly. "You've made your choice, Karen. Now it's my turn." Without waiting for a response, he hung up, his chest heaving. He didn't know what he planned to do next, but the rage inside him needed to be released. He needed to see her, to confront her one last time. As the minutes ticked by, his mind raced. He thought of the house, their marriage, their life, the life that now felt like a lie. He thought of Jason, the man who had stolen his wife from under his nose. Dr. Turner's thoughts turned darker, more dangerous. Without thinking, he drove back home. Karen was waiting for him when he arrived. She stood by the door, her hands wringing the hem of her shirt, her eyes red from crying. Her posture was hesitant, unsure, but she still looked like the woman he had married. The sight of her sent a jolt of anger through his veins. "You have no right to call me," Dr. Turner snapped, stepping past her into the house. "You don't get to come crawling back now. It's too late for that." "Richard, please, Karen began, but Dr. Turner cut her off, his voice rising with each word. "You're nothing but a liar and a cheat, Karen. How could you do this to me, after everything I've done for you, for us?" Karen took a step back, her face pale with fear. She opened her mouth to say something, but Dr. Turner was already past the point of reasoning. His mind had snapped. Every bit of self-control he had left was evaporating in the heat of his rage. "You should have stayed with him," Dr. Turner shouted. "You wanted him. You wanted his attention, his touch, so go ahead and have him. But don't you dare come back to me now asking for forgiveness." Karen reached out to him, but Dr. Turner shoved her hand away, sending her stumbling backward. She gasped, her body trembling as she caught herself against the wall. "Richard, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I didn't mean to hurt you." The pain in her voice only fueled his anger. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had shared his life with, had torn him apart. Every word she said now felt like a mockery of everything they had built together. Dr. Turner stepped forward, his anger blinding him. "I gave you everything, Karen, and you repay me like this?" As his words echoed in the room, he suddenly felt a surge of powerlessness. What had he become? A man consumed by vengeance, by the need to punish the woman he loved? But it was too late. The damage had been done. In that moment, Dr. Turner made a choice. He couldn't go back. Not anymore. With a final, shuddering breath, he turned away from her and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. Dr. Turner's mind was a storm of confusion and fury as he walked away from the house. The confrontation with Karen had drained him, but it had also unleashed something far darker within him. He couldn't go back now. He had no choice but to leave, but his heart was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. As he stepped into his car, he gripped the steering wheel with shaking hands, the images of Karen's tear-streaked face and the coldness in her eyes haunting him. His world, once stable and predictable, had fractured beyond recognition. Karen, on the other hand, stood at the door, watching him drive away. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the reality of what she had done hit her with full force. She was alone now, truly alone, and the emptiness inside her was overwhelming. She had wanted to fix things, to find a way to make it all work, but the damage was done. Richard was gone. The man she had loved for so many years, the father of her children, was no longer part of her life. Her thoughts drifted back to Jason, but even his presence felt distant now. What had she done? She had destroyed everything. Jason had once been a source of comfort, but now his name left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had crossed a line, and in doing so she had lost both men. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, the weight of the realization pressing down on her chest. She could barely breathe. Meanwhile, Dr. Turner drove aimlessly through the streets of Chicago, the city around him a blur. His thoughts were jumbled, a mess of anger, betrayal, and despair. He could still hear Karen's voice, soft and pleading, but all he could feel now was the overwhelming urge to escape the suffocating reality that surrounded him. His career, his marriage, his whole life. It had all unraveled in a matter of days. He thought about going back to the hospital, losing himself in the familiar sterile halls. But he knew it wouldn't help. His mind would still be consumed by the images of Karen and Jason, of the lies, the secrets, and the irreparable damage that had been done. He couldn't run from it. He couldn't escape the truth. The evening stretched on, and he found himself driving to a quiet park at the edge of the city. He parked the car and sat there in the dark, staring out at the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. The silence was almost comforting, but it did nothing to soothe the storm inside him. It was then that his phone buzzed. It was a text from Karen. His hand trembled as he opened it. "I'm sorry, Richard. I never meant to hurt you. Please, can we talk?" His heart clenched at the message, and a wave of bitterness flooded through him. How could she ask him for forgiveness after everything? How could she think that words could fix what had been broken? The message seemed to mock him, a final insult after all the pain she had caused. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Instead, he deleted the message and turned off his phone. There was nothing left to say. Karen's voice echoed in his mind, her apology ringing hollow. He couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and he had no place in her life anymore. She had chosen to walk away from their marriage, to betray him with Jason. And now, as the weight of his anger and heartbreak began to settle in, he realized there was no turning back. He had to move on. But where did that leave him? What did his life mean now? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the window of the car. Startled, Dr. Turner turned to see a man standing outside, a figure he barely recognized at first, but then it hit him. It was Jason. Dr. Turner's pulse quickened. He felt a surge of adrenaline course through his body, his instincts telling him to drive away, to escape whatever confrontation this man was about to bring. But his anger flared. He had nowhere to go, no one left. He opened the door, stepping out to face the younger man. Jason looked calm, but there was a tension in his posture, a nervous energy in his movements. "I didn't want it to come to this, Richard," Jason said, his voice low but firm. "But you need to understand something. Karen and I—" Dr. Turner cut him off, his voice sharp. "Understand? Understand what, Jason? That you've been sleeping with my wife? That you've stolen everything from me?" Jason stood his ground, his expression hardening. "You don't get it. Karen and I get it," Dr. Turner spat. "You think this is some game, don't you? You think you can just waltz in and take what's mine and I'm supposed to accept it?" Jason took a step closer, his voice growing colder. "You don't know what she's been through. You don't know how bad things got." Dr. Turner's anger flared once more. "I know exactly what happened. She chose you, Jason. She chose you over me." The words stung more than he cared to admit, but the bitterness was undeniable. He had loved Karen with everything he had, and now she was with someone else. And Jason, standing in front of him, was the symbol of everything he had lost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that silence, Dr. Turner realized that this was it. There was nothing left for him here, nothing to fight for anymore. And with that realization, the final pieces of his world shattered. The courtroom was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the wood of the prosecutor's desk. Dr. Richard Turner sat in the defendant's chair, his head low, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His mind was numb, unable to focus on the words being spoken around him. All he could think about was the devastating journey that had led him here, the affair, the confrontation, and the aftermath that had consumed him. Now it was time to face the consequences. Karen sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of sorrow and guilt. She had agreed to testify, to stand before the court and tell her side of the story. But every word she had spoken to the prosecutor felt like a betrayal. She knew she was partly to blame for what had happened, but she hadn't anticipated that it would come to this. As the trial began, the prosecutor, a sharp and methodical woman, called Karen to the stand. She had been prepared for this moment, but as Karen stepped forward, her legs shook and her voice faltered. The jury watched her, their eyes fixed on the woman whose actions had led to the destruction of a once loving marriage. The tension in the room was thick, and Karen felt it in every fiber of her being. "Miss Turner," the prosecutor began, her voice firm, "can you explain to the court how your affair with Jason Hart began?" Karen hesitated. She knew the questions would be difficult, but this one hit her hardest. The affair had been a result of her own deep-seated unhappiness, but it was so much more complicated than that. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She thought about Dr. Turner, the man who had once been her everything, the father of their children, and the one who had never once questioned her loyalty until it was too late. It started slowly," Karen said finally, her voice breaking. "I was lonely. I felt invisible in my marriage. Dr. Turner was always at work. We had grown apart." She paused, her gaze flicking nervously to Dr. Turner, who sat with his head bowed, his face unreadable. Karen's heart ached as she spoke, the truth weighing heavily on her chest. "And you became involved with Mr. Hart during this time?" the prosecutor pressed. Karen nodded, the tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, it wasn't something I planned, but it happened." "Did you ever tell Dr. Turner about the affair?" the prosecutor asked, her voice sharp. Karen shook her head. "No, I didn't have the courage to. I was ashamed and scared. I didn't know how to fix what had gone wrong." The prosecutor glanced at the jury, then turned back to Karen. "And when you were confronted by Dr. Turner, what did you say?" Karen's throat tightened. She remembered that moment all too clearly. The confrontation in their living room, his fury, his betrayal. She had tried to explain herself, but the damage had already been done. She couldn't take back the affair. She couldn't take back the lies. "I tried to explain," Karen whispered, "but I don't think he was listening. I couldn't undo what I had done." As Karen's testimony came to a close, the prosecutor nodded and stepped back, allowing the defense attorney to question her. Dr. Turner's defense attorney, a composed man with a cold demeanor, stood and began his questioning. He was trying to paint a picture of a man who had been pushed to the edge, a man whose life had been destroyed by his wife's infidelity. His strategy was clear: to shift the blame, to present Dr. Turner as the victim. "Miss Turner," he began, his voice steady, "you claim that you were lonely, that your marriage had lost its spark. But you chose to have an affair. You chose to betray your husband. Can you explain why?" Karen's eyes filled with tears again. The question was brutal, but she had no choice but to answer. I don't know. I was looking for something I felt I was missing, but it doesn't excuse what I did. I made a terrible mistake." Dr. Turner's hands clenched at his sides, the words hitting him like a punch in the gut. He had heard the same excuses over and over, but hearing them now, in front of the jury, in front of everyone, it felt like a cruel reminder of how his life had been torn apart. After Karen's testimony, it was Dr. Turner's turn to take the stand. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked up to the witness stand. He could feel the weight of the jury's eyes on him, their judgment already heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Part of him wanted to lash out, to tell the world how deeply he had been hurt, but the other part of him just wanted it all to end. "Dr. Turner," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court how this affair affected you?" Dr. Turner swallowed hard, the weight of his emotions threatening to break through. "It destroyed me," he said, his voice low but steady. "I trusted Karen with everything, and she betrayed me. She betrayed our family, our life together. I never saw it coming." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the courtroom was silent. But Dr. Turner wasn't done. "I tried to save my marriage. I tried to understand, but I couldn't. The pain was too much, and I lost myself in it." The prosecutor nodded, but her expression was unreadable. Dr. Turner's words had struck a chord with the jury, but whether that would make a difference, he didn't know. As the day drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Both sides had presented their arguments. Now it was up to the jury to decide. The courtroom was tense, suffocating with anticipation. The air seemed to thicken as the jury filed in, each member taking their seat, their faces unreadable. Dr. Turner sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Karen sat in the front row, her face pale, her eyes swollen from the tears she had shed earlier. She hadn't expected any of this to unfold in the way it had, but now she was here, powerless, awaiting the judgment of the court. The judge called for silence, and the room fell still. All eyes were on the jury, their faces a mix of uncertainty and resolve. The prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged glances, both waiting for the moment of truth. The decision that had been in their hands for days was now about to be revealed. The foreman of the jury stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat before speaking, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Richard Turner, guilty of assault," the foreman said, his voice steady but somber. The words hit Dr. Turner like a physical blow. His chest constricted, his breath caught in his throat. The weight of the conviction settled over him, heavy and suffocating. He had known it was a possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. He sat motionless, as if the words had stolen his ability to move. The room seemed to spin as the reality of the verdict sank in. "However," the foreman continued, "the jury has recommended a sentence of probation rather than jail time due to the circumstances surrounding the defendant's emotional state at the time of the incident." The room remained silent for a moment as the words settled in. Dr. Turner's heart pounded in his chest. The relief that he wouldn't face imprisonment was fleeting, swallowed by the realization that his life, his career, and his marriage were all gone. The judgment had been delivered, but what did it really mean for him? Karen's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the verdict. She wasn't sure if they were tears of relief or sorrow, but they blurred her vision as she wiped them away. The outcome wasn't what she had hoped for, but it wasn't unexpected. She had known, deep down, that the consequences of their actions would be severe. Her mind wandered to the trial, to the moments she had spent on the stand, explaining her actions and the pain that had led to her affair. She had tried to explain, to make sense of it all, but now it felt like it had all been in vain. She had betrayed the man who had stood by her, the man who had given her everything, and now, as the verdict echoed in her mind, she wondered if it had all been worth it. Dr. Turner, meanwhile, felt a wave of numbness wash over him. He was aware of the court's proceedings, but his mind was elsewhere. He was already thinking about the future, about what lay ahead for him. The career he had worked so hard to build was gone. The trust he had once placed in Karen had evaporated, and though he had been given a second chance in the form of probation, he couldn't shake the feeling that it would never be enough to erase the damage that had been done. The defense attorney stood and made a motion for Dr. Turner to be allowed to remain out on bail until his sentencing hearing. The judge granted the request, though the tension in the room didn't ease. Karen stood up slowly, her gaze shifting to Dr. Turner. She wanted to speak to him, to somehow make amends for what had happened, but the distance between them felt too vast, too insurmountable. She left the courtroom quietly, her footsteps echoing as she walked down the hall. There was no confrontation, no final words between them. The damage had been done, and there was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Turner stood alone, the cool air brushing against his face. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders as he stared into the distance. His life had been turned upside down, and though he had been given a reprieve, he wasn't sure it would matter in the long run. The verdict had been delivered, but the real punishment was the one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The emotional scars, the broken trust, and the loneliness that came with it. Those were the things that couldn't be undone, no matter the outcome in court. Dr. Turner took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs but offering little comfort. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Turner sat in his car, parked outside his once familiar home. The house that had been a symbol of his success, his family, his life, now seemed like an empty shell. His heart ached as he stared at it, feeling as though it were mocking him. The very walls he had built his life around were now silent, cold, and unwelcoming. The world he had worked so hard to create had crumbled, leaving nothing but shards of what once was. He hadn't gone back inside since the verdict. After the trial, after Karen had left, after everything fell apart, he couldn't bring himself to face the empty rooms, the quiet spaces that were once filled with laughter and love. How could he go back? How could he face the life that had been destroyed by his own hands, by his own actions, by the uncontrollable rage that had overtaken him that night? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Karen. His stomach churned as he looked at the screen. "I'm sorry, Richard. I still love you. I know I've hurt you, but I don't want to lose you." His fingers hovered over the screen, the words feeling like a slap in the face. She still loved him? After everything? After the affair, the lies, the betrayal? He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that she thought these words would make a difference, or the bitter realization that, despite everything, a part of him still wanted to believe her. He didn't respond. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Dr. Turner ran a hand through his hair, his mind a mess of emotions. The weight of his actions, the anger he had felt, had driven him to the brink, and now he was paying the price. His career was gone, his marriage was shattered, and his reputation was in ruins. He had lost everything, not just the trust of the woman he loved, but his very sense of who he was. He wasn't the respected surgeon anymore. He wasn't the man who saved lives. He was just another man who had failed. He opened the car door and stepped out, the cold air hitting him like a slap. The sky above was dark, the stars barely visible through the haze of the city's lights. He looked around, but everything seemed foreign now, as though he had been thrust into a world he didn't recognize. Walking toward the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate, Dr. Turner couldn't help but think about the choices he had made. The anger that had consumed him, the rage that had driven him to lash out at Karen, had been the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. And now he was left with the wreckage, the consequences of his actions. There was no going back. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. A part of him wanted to go inside, to try and fix what was broken, but another part of him knew it was too late. The damage had been done. The life they had once shared was gone, and all that was left was the wreckage of their past. With a sigh, Dr. Turner turned away from the door and walked down the path leading to the driveway. His life had been reduced to this, a broken man alone with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. Karen, too, was grappling with the aftermath of everything. She had tried to reach out to Dr. Turner, to explain herself, to apologize for the pain she had caused. But no matter how many times she texted, called, or begged for forgiveness, it seemed to have no effect. Richard was gone, and the void in her heart was growing larger with each passing day. She sat alone in her apartment, staring at the phone in her hand. The silence in her life was deafening. She had told herself that being with Jason would make everything better, but now she realized the truth. She had lost everything, her marriage, her family, the love she had taken for granted. It was all gone, and there was no one left to blame but herself. Karen's eyes filled with tears as she thought about the man she had betrayed. Richard, the man who had given her everything. She had once believed that he would always be there for her, but now she was left with nothing but the wreckage of their shattered lives. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the fallout to be so devastating. It was as if everything had fallen apart at once, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. But where could she start? How could she fix something that had been broken beyond repair? Dr. Turner walked aimlessly, his mind consumed with regret. He had reached the end of the road, and there was no way forward. The life he had known was gone, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The world around him was silent, and the emptiness inside him was overwhelming. He could feel it closing in, tightening around his chest, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. He had no one to blame but himself. As the night stretched on, Dr. Turner realized something he had been avoiding. The hardest part wasn't the loss of his career or the collapse of his marriage. It wasn't even the public humiliation. The hardest part was realizing that the man he had once been, the man who had been proud of his achievements, of his family, was gone, and in his place was a man who was broken, lost, and unsure of who he was anymore. 1 year had passed since the trial, since the shattered remnants of Dr. Turner's life had been exposed for the world to see. The media had long since moved on to other stories, but for Richard, the echoes of his past still lingered in every corner of his existence. It was as if he were living in the shadow of his own former self, the person he used to be before the affair, before the rage, before everything fell apart. The hospital had terminated his contract soon after the verdict was handed down. The loss of his career had been devastating, but even worse was the feeling of being a stranger in his own life. The pride he had once felt in his work, the identity he had built for himself, was now a distant memory. He found himself searching for purpose, but it seemed to elude him no matter how hard he tried. He had moved into a small apartment in the city, far from the house that had once been filled with the sounds of his family, the house that now felt like a relic of a life he could never reclaim. The apartment was modest, nothing like the home he had shared with Karen, but it provided a semblance of peace, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. It wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle to face the reality of what he had lost. The loneliness weighed heavily on him, and there were days when the silence felt unbearable. He would wake up, go through the motions of the day, and then return to an empty apartment. It was a life of routine, but not one he had ever envisioned for himself. One evening, as he sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. It was a message from Karen. "I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to reach out. I think of you often. I hope you're doing okay." The message was brief, but it sent a wave of emotions crashing through him. He hadn't heard from her since the trial, since everything had collapsed. Her words, though simple, carried with them an immense weight. She had never reached out before, never tried to make contact in the aftermath. Yet here she was, a year later, sending a message that reopened the wound he had spent months trying to numb. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He didn't know what to say. Could he forgive her? Could he even bring himself to respond after everything that had happened? Finally, he typed back, "I'm okay. It's been a long road. I hope you're finding peace, Karen." The words came easier than he expected. He wasn't sure if he had truly forgiven her, but he was no longer consumed by the burning anger that had once defined him. The bitterness, though still present, had dulled with time. There was no denying the pain she had caused him, but he had learned that holding on to that pain only kept him trapped in the past. Minutes later, she replied, "Thank you, Richard. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Her message was brief, but the sincerity behind it was undeniable. He didn't know if she was truly sorry or if she was just trying to ease her own guilt, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of closure. Dr. Turner set his phone down, taking a deep breath. He didn't feel better, but he felt lighter. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't something that would come overnight, and maybe it would never come fully. But the anger that had once ruled his life had been replaced by a quiet acceptance. He wasn't ready to forget, but he was learning to move forward. The following week, Dr. Turner made a decision. He enrolled in a local counseling program, determined to find a way to heal. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to face it. As he walked down the path of recovery, he thought about his children, who had distanced themselves from him in the wake of the scandal. He thought about Karen and about the life they had shared, knowing that it was irreparably broken. But as painful as those thoughts were, he understood now that healing would require him to let go of the past, to find peace in the present, and to begin rebuilding from the rubble of his shattered life. In time, Dr. Turner found a new purpose. He didn't return to surgery. That chapter of his life had closed forever. But he found peace in helping others, in listening, in guiding those who were struggling with their own battles. In a small way, he began to rebuild himself. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, but it was a life nonetheless. And so, as the years passed, Dr. Turner learned to live again. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, but he could choose to move forward, to find meaning in the pieces of his broken life. And that, in itself, was a kind of redemption. What do you think of Dr. Richard Turner's journey through betrayal and emotional turmoil? Do you believe he can ever find peace after everything that happened? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with viewers from all over the world.